So just to let folks who haven't, who didn't attend either the July or August sessions, just to let you know a little bit how this works. Uh, First, what we're going to do is a little introduction. I'm going to actually, because this is the first session, I'm going to give a couple of instructions, and then we're going to do an introduction a little bit a different way. The last 2 months in these series, I read very formal introductions, and instead of doing that, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what I adore about the people who are presenting, and share a little bit about them, and have them sort of fill in whatever blanks they want to fill in. And then we're going to make sure at the end that we'll talk about any formal thing like books that you need to know about that Cornelius has written, and the other presenters as well. So, and then what will happen is I will shut my camera and mic off and just give the floor to Cornelius for a little while, as long as he wants. And then he will do some presenting, and then I will ask a couple questions I have, and then we will open it up to questions from you all. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A box and not the chat box. The chat box just moves too fast for us to keep up with questions. So use feel free to use the chat box to process things and share resources as we're going. But if you have a question, use the Q&A, and all of the sessions will be recorded, and you will have access to those sessions. So this is being recorded right now, and every Tuesday night we do the session. Every Wednesday, by the end of the day, I send out a link to the recording. So that's how it is going to work. So Cornelius.
Yes.
So here's the fun thing about, I knew of Cornelius, and people always told me I needed to check out his book and get to know him. And then finally, when it took a pandemic,
Yes.
and then we were both in this Liberate and Chill group, and I really encourage you all to check out Liberate and Chill. It's another great learning opportunity. And we were both, as well as Cornelius's partner, Cass, all three of us were invited, and I finally got an opportunity to get to know Cornelius and Cass, and it's just been such a pleasure. And I feel like I've met like long lost friends or something. So I just want to say a little bit about what I love about Cornelius. There's nobody I know that combines a really powerful, deep critical lens and also a positivity and love in the way that Cornelius does. That's one of the most beautiful things that I've ever seen. And I've seen a lot of people do a lot of stuff around equity and justice. I think to me, that's what stands out the most about Cornelius. I think a lot of times some of the people who are choosing kind of that love and connection approach are doing that as a way out of the critical lens. Mm-hmm. Cornelius has figured out a way to use that as a way to create space for the critical lens and to ask hard questions and to say hard stuff. And I could tell you from experience that it's a very difficult thing to manufacture if it's not in your heart. And so that's what I love about Cornelius. He's brilliant, but he's also big-hearted, and he will hug you and whisper the hardest thing you've ever heard in your life to you while he's hugging you. And I think that's the way we build community around this work. So I'm going to hand it over to Cornelius, and maybe you can say a little bit about yourself in a more technical sense, if you want, a little bit about your background. And I will allow you to do a screen share too. And here is the brilliant Cornelius Minor.
Well, thank you, Paul. Like, I think, and I'm just so glad that you started with that idea of love. It's been a thing that I've been channeling a lot recently. Like, these are incredibly hard times. I am in New York City, and as we are trying to make our way back to classrooms and back to remote and hybrid learning, things have been really difficult here. And and people ask me sometimes, these last few days, people have been like, Cornelius, are you okay? And I think I need to start my talk today by saying that, like, actually, I am not okay. Like, things have been so intense, with me as a father, worried about the safety of my own kids and what it means to go back to school, me as a practitioner, and worried about my contact with hundreds upon thousands of people, that all of us carry this worry into this moment. And as I have considered this particular moment, I have been considering all of my forebears in education, that I owe my career as an educator to Miss Hemingway, Dr. Hemingway in Florida, who is retired now, but was one of my great teachers. And when I think about where that ethic of love and of care came from, it came from people like her. One of the things that some of you know about me is that I am an immigrant to the United States of America. My parents brought me to this country in order to escape a civil war in my home, Liberia. And so I came to this country as a refugee away from a civil war. And my teachers were the people who embraced me with love, but it was a fierce kind of love. It was the kind of love that fought for an immigrant kid. It was the kind of love that stood up to white supremacy when no one wanted, a scrawny Black kid from West Africa in their programs or in their classes. It was the kind of love that rewrote policy so that it can include me. And so when I think about the work that I do, all of it comes from that place, that criticality and that love. I really think about it as not just an entry point and a primary tool, but as the way forward, especially in these days of uncertainty. And so thank you for being here today. Of course, there's the other bio stuff. Yes, I write books and I teach classes and stuff like that. But most importantly, this evening, I am here with you, and we're really here to study together a little bit about what it means to teach in anti-oppressive ways, but to teach the content of anti-oppressive content in ways that don't traumatize kids, right? And in ways that don't hurt kids. And so I wanted to just take a few minutes for a couple of general comments to start us off, and then we'll break for a small conversation between Paul and I, and we will be centering your questions. As I listen to you and as I think about your work today, one of the things that I am going to do is I'm going to send you some readings through Paul. So as I think about the issues that are raised today, and as I think about the questions that come up, what I'll do then is I'll send Paul an email, and so there will be documents coming your way that really build a bridge between what is said here this evening and the work that happens in your classroom and school spaces. So again, thank you so much for being here, and I'm really excited to share with you. I'm going to do the obligatory screen sharing here, where here we go. And so I wanted to start really, as I was preparing for this presentation, really the thing that has been on my mind the heaviest is just this concept of what it even means to do school right now. As we are making our way through this pandemic, it's not over yet. We're making our way through this pandemic. We're making our way through this contemporary moment where we who love humanity are having to assert yet again that Black Lives Matter and that Black trans lives matter, right? We're in this important moment. So what does it mean to even do school in this important moment? And I think one of the things that I wanted to lead with and to start with, as I look out on all of you through this webcam, I just wanted to say that I see you. Again, like I started, I am preparing for a school year like no other. And we haven't even met students yet, but already the fatigue and the frustration is setting in alongside the promise and the potential of this year to come. And so I just wanted to say, for all of you who are working and preparing to go back, for all of you who are already there, I see you. And for those of you who are school leaders, I mean, just the incredible responsibility that you bring into this. This has been the heaviest thing in my universe as I think about keeping a whole community safe. And so for all of you who are working alongside me, yes. And, I think it's important to just name as I start to talk about doing work that is anti-racist and anti-classist and anti-ableist and anti-homophobic, doing this work, I think it's important to name that now more than ever, it is integral that we recognize and just appreciate all the people who work closely with children day in and day out. And because of that, when I think about that, and I've just been setting some big context, as we engage in these conversations together, I just want to acknowledge again that these conversations are not happening in a vacuum, that as educators, we are working through the greatest period of professional uncertainty in the last decade. What we are attempting to do right now, what we are attempting to do tomorrow, next week, has never been done before. So our work is not going to be perfect or predictable. In many instances, it will not even be comfortable. And I think it's really, really important to name as we start this journey together, and you're going to have lots of my friends and colleagues in this course with you, that this current pandemic and this shift to remote learning has revealed to so many people what educators like us who represent historically marginalized groups have been articulating for years, that there are profound inequities in schooling. And I think my great frustration is this idea that there are some people who mistake knowing about the issues facing school communities for actually doing community work. So there's this confusion. People mistake knowing about equity for doing equity. And I just want to name as we start that I lean into the active verb of doing, that everything that we study together must be about how we turn around and do things tomorrow in service of communities and in service of children. And so as I think about what this work can look like, one of the things that people sign up, they sign up to study with Paul or they sign up to study with me, and people are always like, Cornelius, what's the best way forward? What's the best thing that my school community can do? What's the best thing that my district can do? And I want to go ahead and name right now that there is no one best way forward. As we think about the path ahead of us, again, there is no one best way forward, but each path does have some essential components that I will be juggling among our thinking today. That self-work is important, examining who we are in relationship to the social forces that shape school, examining who we are in relationship to racism and classism and sexism and ableism and homophobia, transphobia. Examining who we are is important self-work, but it doesn't stop there. Also, systemic awareness is important. Understanding those oppressive systems that exist outside of school and understanding how those oppressive systems creep into our work in school and in classrooms and with children and in communities is important. That we can do no great good for any community without understanding the systems that shape it. Also, this work is going to be about active change making, that knowing about systemic racism, knowing about homophobia, knowing about ableism changes nothing. Disrupting those systems is what changes things. So active change making is important, that there are people who hide behind their fear or their unwillingness to change, and that cannot be us as we engage students in this work. And then of course, all of that rests on the foundation of powerful teaching. And that's what we're here to talk about this evening. What does it mean to enter classroom spaces and teach in this way? And so welcome, thank you for being a part of this journey. We're really excited to have you here. I also wanted to name in all of this that I am striving to be the best possible human that I can be for children, especially now. But we are human. And so that means that we're allowed to be angry and sad and unsure and scared. And so that I am afraid does not make me unworthy. That I am afraid does not make me unworthy of doing this work. That I get sad sometimes, that I'm unsure of myself sometimes, that does not make me unworthy of doing this work. That all of these things are human and appropriate. And so when we think about this contemporary moment, when we think about the frustrations of returning to school in the middle of a pandemic, when we think about not having access to the resources that we need, when we think about the stubborn white supremacist among us, when we think about those school boards who block policy and access, we don't have to get over these things, that we don't have to get used to these things, that we can hold on to our anger and still forge a reality that is good for children and good for us. We can nurture our sadness, we can become more sure, we can look past our fear and forge a reality. And that's what this work is really all about. So I want to just jump right into the teaching stuff then, and just kind of give us a general start. and then we'll break for questions and for chat. But when I think about teaching, I walk into every classroom space with a set of values that guide my work. And so I am making those public. I'm sharing those. And there's so many of you here who know me and know the work that we've done together. So my Seattle people are here, my California people are here, my Wisconsin people are here, my Georgia people are here, my Florida people are here, my New York people definitely in the house. We always here. But that as we move into classroom spaces, it's important to name that we believe in human-centered care, that we put people before policy every time. And so as I craft these lessons in front of you today, it is important to know that everything comes back to a human center. Before policy, before standards, there are humans, there are children. And so everything that I do in a classroom, I filter through these values. And as I read through these values, I'll kind of share with you some questions that I asked to reflect on them. I also understand that no one learns from just listening to their teacher talk, that we are teaching kids about the topics and the forces that in many ways will govern the outcomes of their lives. We're talking to kids about how racial oppression works, how racism weaponizes an economic system, how racism weaponizes the education system, how racism weaponizes social services. And so these are the things that will touch kids forever, right? And so no one learns by just listening to their teacher talk. So when I'm teaching kids about these things, I can't just talk at them. The children learn best when they have opportunities to practice. So really, teaching isn't just sharing information with kids. It is not simply a didactic exercise. The teaching is fostering opportunities for kids to practice. It is also important to recognize that multiple literacies exist and that all of those literacies are valuable. So as we teach kids how to be bigger than the racist or the sexist or the homophobes that raised them, like it is important to understand that multiple literacies exist side by side, and we're teaching kids to be bigger than we are, bigger than we've ever been, right? And so as we teach kids to do this powerful work in their communities and in their schools, it's important to note that the child who writes a 5-paragraph essay to elaborate on their thinking is not more capable than the kid who sketches a diagram. That we can lead and teach in ways that acknowledge that these multiple literacies exist. And so as I craft lessons with you, you will see me leaning into the reality that kids express and move through space in different ways, and that my teaching must allow for that. Finally, flexibility, creativity, and innovation must define our work, not fidelity to programs or rules or long-established ways of doing things. That we are allowed to abandon yesterday's thinking if it does not serve today's dynamic needs. And so as we construct lessons, you will see that these lessons bear the fingerprint of our current historical moment and not of yesterday's orthodoxy. Finally, in the work that we do, justice matters. So this means that I center kids, especially the kids who have been most marginalized by school, understanding that not all kids will get the same thing as I plan. And so these are the values that I bring with me into a classroom. And really all of that rests on a foundation that we can do this work with respect to our own physical and mental and emotional health. And so as I think about these values, everything that I do in a classroom, I run it by a few questions. The first question I always ask myself is, does this thing that I want to do in my classroom align with these values? And if it does not, then I have to revise the thing so that it does. But I wanted to kind of share that so that you will see kind of all the dimensions of my lesson planning as I think about like planning the kinds of lessons that support kids powerfully. And then my lesson planning must also be built on my own understanding. And I'll say this again, our lesson planning must be built on our own understanding. So if my racial literacy is low, then my lesson planning will not be complete. If my racial consciousness is, not strong, then my lessons will not be strong. And so I always like to double down on my content knowledge whenever I'm lesson planning. And of course, we don't have all evening, but one of the things that I want for all kids to know at all ages, right? I'm the father of a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. And when I think about how I talk to my own children about racism, about sexism, about classism, about homophobia, when I think about how I talk to my kids about oppression, I want to name for kids that self-interest is at the center of sustained injustice. Again, self-interest is at the center of sustained injustice. That we, for far too long as a profession, have been stuck on teaching kids to be nice, right? So we've established this false binary. And so kids somehow walk out of schools, walk out of classrooms believing that injustice comes down to people who are either nice or mean. And so people are able to absolve themselves of all of their investments in racism, of all of their investments in sexism, because they're like, well, I'm nice, so I can't possibly be sexist, or I'm nice, so I can't possibly be racist, right? And we know that when we are talking about sustained injustice, we're not talking about whether or not people are nice. We're talking about whether or not people have consciously invested in the systems that oppress and marginalize others. And so really at the center of injustice is people's failure to empathize, their failure to see others as fully human and to act on what they see, even when it means acting in the interest of others and not in the interest of self. And so when I engage kids in explicit teaching that is anti-racist, that does not harm children in the classroom, I center my teaching around the idea that we can take articulated interest in people who are not us, and we can act on those interests. Empathy. Now, again, so many people use empathy as a wimpy term, right? Oh, empathy, and I'm going to tie that to niceness. No, that empathy is tied specifically to actions that empower others who are not me, others who are not in my group. And so when I think about how teaching goes, kids need practice at empathy. They need practice at moral ambiguity. They need practice at plotting courses of action that reflect what they know and what they're learning. They need practice at evaluating the impact of their actions, and they need practice at actively revising their actions so that they can improve the quality of their impact. Now, adults need this practice too. And so when I craft lessons for kids, I craft lessons that give them practice at those things: empathy, moral ambiguity, plotting courses of action, evaluating impact, and active revision. That I can couple those things with arts, with mathematics, with language arts, with social studies, with the sciences. And so those are the kind of things that I hold tightly to as I engage in lesson planning. I want to pause here just to give folks an opportunity to process some of this stuff. I realize this is a lot coming at you really fast. One of the things I've prepared for you this evening is to walk you through the experience of what it can mean to plan lessons around this core. But I want to pause again just to give people an opportunity to kind of process some of this. And so I'm going to kind of pull my screen down here and stop sharing and just kind of like check in with Paul and kind of check the questions that are coming in. And then in a moment, I'll kind of share with you what all of this looks like when executed in the form of lesson planning and grade team meeting and standards alignment and all of that stuff. But I just want to check in, so I'm kind of checking the question box right now. And then Paul, if there's anything coming up, certainly let me know. So I'm going to pause, give you about 30 seconds to process. I'm reading your questions now.
There's definitely some good questions popping up. I would love to, but I would love to ask a question myself, just as we have a little pause here.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see, I could see some people again sort of conflating that sort of empathy with niceness, in the way that people conflate teaching students how to appreciate diversity with teaching students anti-racism.
Exactly.
I wonder how do you distinguish those things? Like, what's the difference between teaching to just to appreciate difference versus teaching anti-racism?
So here's the interesting thing. I just talked about this with my 8-year-old, so she could actually come in here and explain this to you. But I said that any act of empathy must be tied to a selfless verb. And so I talk with my 8-year-old about being selfless. So when you empathize with a person, that's not just a feeling, that's an action. And so when you feel empathy, that has to be tied to a verb. And and here's why it came up in our household. And I'll be honest here, so I might be putting people's business in the street. But one of the struggles that we're having right now at school is that a lot of my colleagues don't feel safe returning. That New York City is making blanket policy for teachers, but when you move from neighborhood to neighborhood, infection rates differ, right? And so in neighborhoods where people don't have access to adequate healthcare, in neighborhoods where there is not enough fresh food, COVID rates have been high. Right. And so in some corners of the Bronx, in some parts of Brooklyn, in some corners of Queens. And so if you're in Manhattan right now and people have access to healthcare, infection rates are decently low. But if you're where I am in Brooklyn, or if you're where some people are in the Bronx, or where some people are in Queens, infection rates are still pretty dangerously high. And so there's this blanket policy that's coming out that's saying that we all have to be back in person some of the days. But then when some of us look around our neighborhoods, things are still not good. And so a lot of my friends and colleagues don't quite feel safe returning. And so we have been having discussions with our PTA, we've been having discussions with local activists about just our feelings and about our concern for community health and putting students at risk and putting ourselves at risk. We've been having these conversations. And one of the things that came up in one of the conversations was a neighborhood parent said to us that I empathize with you all, but I still think you all need to be back in classrooms. And so his empathy was not tied to any kind of action. And so when my daughter saw me, I was visibly frustrated. And so she was asking me, Dad, like, why are you down? And I was sharing with her that there are people who are using empathy in empty ways, that his ability to understand where I'm coming from is not tied to selfless action, to act on behalf of teachers. And so he, with his words, says that he sees us, but his actions ignore our humanity. And so when I framed it for my daughter, I'm framing it just like I frame it for you all, that any act of empathy must be tied to action that sees people's full humanity. And so that means that action needs to be rooted in insight gained from that group of people. That action needs to be rooted or tied to impacts that benefit those groups of people. And so one of the things, again, that I share with my own young children is that when you empathize with someone, that means that you act on their behalf, even when it is not in your own personal self-interest. And so my 8-year-old and I are practicing that right now, that how to practice empathy in these supportive ways. Yeah.
There's a lot of other, did you want to go back to part of a presentation, or do you want me to start?
And I can pause. I see some questions popping up, and whenever I see the question numbers come up, I want to pause and kind of address people's ideas, and then I can jump back to the presentation in a moment. Okay. But I want to make sure that I honor folks' questions.
And let me ask you one more question. This is a quick one, and then I'll give you some other people's questions. When you are with young people and you're teaching anti-racism, how are you helping them understand just what racism is, not just interpersonal, but understanding it also at the structural, institutional, systemic level? How do you make those connections for young people?
And it really depends on the group of kids, but the last group of kids, I'll share with you this. I used a game of Monopoly with the last group of kids. And so this is pre-pandemic. So this was January 2020, back when, people could touch each other and give high fives. But in January, I was working with a group of fifth graders. And the way that I introduced them to this concept was I talked to them about Monopoly, and I shared the rules of Monopoly with them. And we started a quick game together. And in the game, I started some people out with property that they inherited from their parents, and some people started with no property. That some people got money that they inherited from their friends, or and right away, kids were like, "This ain't right," right away. And one of the first things I remember, one of the fifth graders turned to his friend, and he started sharing his money with his friend. And he was like, "Well, I started out with all this extra money because Mr. Miner said that I inherited it from grandparents. And so I am way ahead in the Monopoly game before the game's even started." And when he started sharing the money, I told him that was against the rules. You can't share. And he's like, "Why can't I share?" And I was just like, "Well, because your ancestors didn't share. So you can't share either." And so kids started questioning that, and they were like, "Well, it's not right. It's not fair." And that gave that really opened up the conversation to understanding how systems of oppression work, how systems of oppression keep people locked up. And I remember one of the kids, and again, this is fifth grade, and he said this probably 2 minutes into the game. He's like, "Some of our friends will never catch up because the rules of the game don't work for them." And so exactly, I'm like, your friends will never catch up because some of you started with an inheritance, some of you started with property already, some of you started with hotels already. And so, some people will never catch up no matter how hard they work, even if they roll all 12s. And so that was a really powerful way. And then from there, we looked at where that shows up in life. And so I am a reading and writing teacher. So we looked at books. And so from there, we looked at characters who can't get ahead and why they can't get ahead. And we thought about, there's that kind of myth of American meritocracy, right? That if you work really hard, these good things will happen for you. And one of the things that the kids like learned really early on, they're like, wait, so you can follow all the rules and still things won't work out for you, even when you work, yeah, and so just that. So like I do a lot with gaming. There was another group of kids, I did it through Pokemon, where we were looking at Pokemon evolutions, right? And I was asking, well, what would happen if an evolved Raichu had to battle a Pichu? And so again, I say it depends on the kids because the cultural references that I use, all like I want to speak developmentally to where the kids are, and I want the cultural references to match who the kids are. And the kids were like, well, that can't happen. That's unfair, like that, and I'm like, well, that's how our society is set up. Our society consistently puts Raichu against Pichu and then blames Pichu for never winning, right? And so some of you who know Pokemon will get those references. But I talk to kids about how, yeah, Raichu, who is evolved and had lots of practice, when put in the same class as Pichu, like Pichu, no matter how hard Pichu works, can't catch up, and the rules make it that way. And so then kids really get into, well, then we should rewrite the rules. The rules shouldn't be this way. And I'm like, that's systemic disruption. What you are just describing is activism, an active rewriting of the rules so that it favors people who are not you. And one of the things that really excites and encourages me is that it takes kids less than 7 minutes to get this stuff. But I have been working with adults for years to understand this. So I usually start with wherever kids are. I talk to kids, I use the word self-interest with kids. And I talk to kids about the feeling that you feel in your gut when you have to act in the interest of others. And so I practice with kids, I practice with snacks, I practice with access to basketballs, that like, if I know that somebody else needs the basketball, but I want the basketball, it's really hard to share the basketball. And so I practice that with kids. And so we spend time in the gym sharing the basketball, and then we examine our feelings. So when you handed the basketball to Paul because he needed it, you felt cheated a little bit. You felt like, I want the basketball. I should have the basketball because I'm bigger. Or I should have the basketball because I have more money. Or I should have the basketball because my dad bought it. But sharing the basketball with Paul leaves you with these really strange feelings. And so working with kids through that kind of like feeling, I had one kid who told me, again, we were in the gym practicing sharing basketballs, and I was connecting it directly to anti-racism, that in communities where, people don't have access to things, like part of our work as people who do have access to things is actively redistributing resources. And here's what that means when you're 8. Here's what that means when you're 10. It means that you get to sit a game out and share. And so I had kids identify the feeling. What does it feel like when you have the basketball and you own the basketball, but you share with people who don't own the basketball and you sit out a game? What that feels like. So that feeling in your stomach, that's called anger. That feeling in your stomach, it's called frustration. And activists work through that anger and work through that frustration for the greater good. And so this is work that really excites me to do with kids. I use a lot of metaphor. And so if kids are into basketball, then I'm on the basketball court teaching this. If kids are into science, I'm in the lab teaching this. If kids are into history, I'm teaching this with historical figures. If kids are into math, I'm teaching this with numbers. That this really lives everywhere. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks. So you want me to give you some participant questions, or you want to get back into your...
Sure. I'll share one thing just to kind of, because I'm browsing through some of the questions now, and they're all coming back to a few things. I want to just like share like one thing really quickly, but really, folks, I am letting your questions really guide the work today. And then of course I'll supplement all this with some readings that have even informed my work. But let's see. When I think about just like kind of the teaching work, again, this idea that it's important that I recognize, even among children, that self-interest is the center of sustained injustice, that racism persists because people keep acting in their own self-interest, right? That that even people who know better, right? And Paul, I love how I read somewhere that you were writing, it was in your email or on your Twitter or somewhere, but people kind of take that know better, do better quote out of context, right? They use it to beat down, real change and real activism. And really, there are people who know better that still don't do better because of self-interest. And so I want to identify that for kids early. And I want to give kids practice at acting in the interest of others. And so when I talk about like that idea of moral ambiguity, I want to put kids in situations where there is no right and wrong, because we push this false binary on kids where you can combat racism by always doing the right thing. Well, right is a relative term. There are people who do the right thing every time, right for them and right for their community, and not right for other people, right? And so I want to put kids in that moral ambiguity and have them practice through that. And I spend time in the cafeteria, on the basketball court, drawing up scenarios for kids where I'm like, hey, help me understand what happens if we don't have enough food to go around, or what happens if we run out of dessert and you've already got, and so building those situations for kids to think their way out of, because there is no right and wrong. Yeah, you can be like, yeah, there's right and right for me, and I can hoard all of the resources. And then I want kids to get good at plotting courses of action. So I talk to kids about, okay, so here's a scenario. What do you think you can do next? So they plot courses of action, and then I give them practice at engaging in those actions. And then we reflect and we evaluate our impact. And so that's really important. But then how can that happen? I have been thinking, and what I'm sharing with you right now is how I plan lessons currently. I've been planning lots of lessons for going back to school in a week. And so this is how I've been building experiences for children that I really like to think actively about the learning outcomes, right? So if I'm in science, if I'm in math, I'm in literature, if I'm in the arts, I think about the learning outcomes. And I like to name outright the learning outcome in my planning. And then I think about different ways that kids can demonstrate progress toward the learning outcome. I'm in writing, right? So I do reading and writing. And so, for example, one of the first things that we're starting with this year is personal narrative. And so kids have to be able to collect ideas to write about independently of an adult's influence. That's one of the learning outcomes. And kids can demonstrate that in any number of ways. So I kind of am really articulate about how they can demonstrate that. Then I think about how I might model this work for kids so that they can move closer to the learning outcomes. My modeling happens in two ways. I like to actively demonstrate the thing that I want to teach in front of kids, especially if I'm demonstrating on a camera. That demonstration is really important, that people have reduced teaching to talking at kids, and teaching is not talking at kids. Teaching is active demonstration. But then I also want to demonstrate my habits of mind. So I want to demonstrate my thinking, how I approach ideas, how I approach problems, how I approach challenges. And then I give kids space and time to practice the skill. And then, of course, I want them to reflect on their learning together, and I want to measure progress. So that's how I build my week. But when I build my week this way, it allows me to attach like work that is anti-racist. So I get to think, okay, what are some habits of mind that anti-racist kids need to bring to their writing? What are habits of mind that anti-racist kids bring to their science, to their math? And so, for example, here's one of my first sessions that I'm planning. So the learning outcome, kids have to learn how to think about topics that they can write about independently. I'm a writing teacher. Again, I teach middle school writing. And then how are they going to demonstrate growth toward this outcome? Well, they can demonstrate that in any number of ways. You can demonstrate that, if you look at this third column, you can demonstrate that by explaining how you got your ideas. You can demonstrate that by just having the idea and writing the story. You can demonstrate that by acting out parts of the story. You can demonstrate that by illustrating story ideas. And you see that I'm leaning into this idea of multiple literacies, that kids can demonstrate their knowing by writing, by doing any number of other things. And then I think about, what am I going to demonstrate for kids so that they can learn this skill? I can show kids how to think about important people. I can show kids how to think about times when there was not a clear answer. I can show kids how to think about big feelings. I can show kids how to think about turning points. And so in those demonstrations, you see all of the anti-racism that I just talked about, that when you are acting in the interest of others, you have to process and think about big feelings. You have to work through frustration. So that I am teaching that in writing is really important. When you have to act in anti-racist ways, you have to act through situations where there's not always a clear answer. And so that I'm teaching this in writing class is really important. But these things don't just belong in writing class. They can belong in social studies. They can belong in math. They can belong in art. And so when I plan, people have this idea that anti-racist planning must be this special conversation where I sit to the side and talk about race. It doesn't have to be that I have embedded anti-racism in my standards aligned writing instruction that I am doing. And so I just wanted to show you that quick demonstration so that you could begin to imagine like how you might do it in your own school. I'm going to pause here, and then Paul and I will move through some questions. And if anybody needs anything, I can share tons of teaching stuff. But like, you came here to interact, and so I want to make sure that Paul and I lean into the interactive portion of this evening. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Cornelius. So there are a lot of good, really great questions. I'm going to try to really focus on questions that are really about teaching anti-racism, and people have asked some other sorts of questions too. But
Okay.
A couple of people are asking questions related to how they feel like, they really want to teach racial justice in their classes, and they want also this to be something that their school commits to, but that they're getting a little pushback around, we have too many other things to focus on right now because of COVID. And so how do you inspire colleagues to get on board with something when they're feeling overwhelmed?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in a way, it's a privilege to get to choose what you're overwhelmed by.
Yeah. And the time to think about racial justice is the time when we are overwhelmed, because that idea of self-interest, when we become overwhelmed, that's when we start to act in our own self-interest and we ignore those who are not us. And so whiteness is most omnipresent when white people are stressed, or when white institutions are stressed. That's when they double down on whiteness. And so the time to engage in racial justice work is when people are most stressed. I think that is really important. And people forget that racial justice is not standing on a soapbox and preaching at people. Racial justice is simply asking the question, does this policy that we're creating, does this lesson that we're writing see all members of this community and see all members of the human family? Like, that's all racial justice is, and so for example, I am working with a science team right now, and this is second grade science, and we're really thinking about what it means to teach science virtually in second grade science. And everybody is stressed about how are kids going to get hands-on experience, and how are kids going to be able to engage with each other, because that's what science is and that's what brings science to life. And I reminded people that this is the time to think about racial justice, now that we're thinking about how people are going to engage. And so what we developed, and we borrowed this from Seymour Simon, he has an amazing book from the 70s called Science in a Vacant Lot, where he goes to an empty lot in the Bronx and just like tinkers with stuff that he finds in an empty lot and does all of these real cool science experiments. And so that, thinking about justice through the lens of second grade science really forced us to think about access and materials. And so what we started doing is we started brainstorming, well, what materials might kids probably have in their homes? What materials are we not sure? How can we distribute materials through the mail to make sure that kids have stuff to like tinker with? And so it forced a stance that we wouldn't have had we not entered the conversation around justice. And so people want to shy away from justice when things get intense, and it's important to lean in because your content is richer. I just worked with a music teacher today, and it was so fun that we were talking about, like, one of the first lessons that she has to teach is kids have to learn how to keep a beat. This is first grade music class. And she's really worried, how do I teach kids how to keep a beat remotely? I'm the music teacher. And then of course us wanting to infuse justice. And so we talked about why beats were important and why it's important to communicate, and why certain groups of people have not been able to communicate, and why beats were taken away from some groups of people. And first graders were like, hell yeah. Well, not hell yeah, but heck yeah. And so first graders were like so excited about that, and so that, that these things, exist everywhere, that we can, I think those people who say that we can't think about justice because we need to think about COVID, or we need to think about remote science, or we need to think about remote music, that is an admission of one's own lack of creativity. That those who embrace justice must embrace the work of creating justice, and that is a creative act. And so when I think about why justice doesn't exist, is because people have embraced their own lack of creativity. And so when I'm talking to teachers, especially in moments as delicate and as fraught with tension as this one, that these are the moments where injustice shows up the brightest. And so we have to be even more vigilant in these moments. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
So there are a few questions also that are sort of around teaching anti-racism in school contexts where there are big majority white people. So you might have in any classroom
Mm-hmm.
very few students of color, students of the global majority.
Yeah.
And how does that change the dynamic, and how can you do that in a way? I mean, I think you've mostly taught in much more diverse environments,
Mm-hmm.
but what are your thoughts on teachers who are in that context, and how do I do this in a way that doesn't shine too bright a spotlight on or kind of re-traumatize uh, students of color?
Yeah, and Paul, like you're like totally dialing right into my journey. Like I think it's, as I answer this question, one of the things that I'll share with you all is that I teach in Brooklyn, New York. So I was teaching for 11 years before I taught my first white student. That segregation is so entrenched in New York City that we live in a diverse city, and this is where diversity falls flat, right? We live in a diverse city, but then when kids go to school at 8:20, shit gets real, right? And so I didn't teach my first white student until 11 years into teaching, and at that point I had started to support teachers around the country in doing this kind of work. So I would fly out to Seattle and do work in Seattle. I would like visit my friends in Oregon and in California, and I went out to California to do some work, and it was my first majority white school. So here I am 11 years in, and I'm working. And so I really grew up with those teachers in California. And I matured so much as an educator. And so when I think about doing this work in ways in mixed communities, right, in ways that do not re-traumatize like Black, Brown students of the global majority, like a few things that are really, really important to me. That so much of what we talk about when we talk about anti-racism centers whiteness and views anything that is not white through a deficit lens. And again, I'll say that again because this is really important. When we talk about race and racism, it holds whiteness as at the center. It holds whiteness as the norm. And so much of what we do in classrooms views anything that is not white through a deficit lens. That deficit operation is traumatizing. And so I practice with those teachers, and shout out to Pacific, California. Those are some of the best teachers on the planet, where we sat together in classrooms and late at night in bars, lesson planning, practicing, and what we had to practice was not seeing kids through a deficit lens. That when we share information with kids, that how do we engage in this work? That again, for example, one of the things that I discovered about my own practice when we were practicing, and again, this is me working in concert with many of my colleagues, and so this is not my work alone, that everything that I've learned because I stay up late with brilliant teachers, right? And so this, we're sitting, and I realized that, again, this is me, gosh, 11 years ago, right? And so I discovered about myself that I only talked about race when something bad had happened. And so if something bad was going on in the news, I would talk about race. And at that time, I think it was Katrina that had just happened. And so I was talking about like race and all of this stuff. And what happened implicitly was, and I had a great literacy coach who helped me to understand this, what had happened implicitly is kids began to associate race with negativity, specifically Blackness with negativity, because the only time it would show up in my instruction is when something bad had happened. And so I had to kind of step back and say, well, Cornelius, why isn't this showing up in your instruction in other ways? And so that is traumatizing for the kid who has to sit in that identity and say that my culture, my people, my experience is only talked about through the lens of something negative. And so if the only time you talk about race, or the only time you talk about African culture, or the only time you talk about what it means to be from Asia is when something bad happens, then we have a problem, right? And that is a traumatizing problem. And so those have been some of the things that I've considered. So I think about not centering whiteness. I think about making race a part of the conversation every day, in every way. And then the third thing that I think about is student feedback, that I listen to kids, that so many of us, and I am guilty of this, again, I study with so many amazing teachers who consistently check my work, who consistently talk back to my work and help me to make it better. But But one of the things that happens is we plow ahead with our lesson plans and we don't consider student need. And so I have made the habit of soliciting student input every 3 days. So every 3 days, I either talk to a kid or talk to a parent or talk to a friend group or a partnership where I am engaged in active information collecting every 3 days. I practice what Yetta Goodman called kid watching, right? So for those of you who are, like who are a long time in education, Yetta Goodman's work is amazing. And so I really lean into this idea of watching and listening to kids and allowing that to inform my practice. And so those are like kind of my top 3 things to avoid traumatizing kids. Again, do not center whiteness or white feelings or white anxiety. Second, that my talk about race is not reserved for times when something bad has happened. And then I think lots about what it means to watch kids and learn from kids in my lesson planning.
So there are also a lot of questions that sort of get at the thing about sort of age appropriateness.
Yeah.
So let's say you're working with me, I'm a teacher, and I say, well, I teach preschool kids, so
Mhm.
we can celebrate diversity, but they're not really ready
Mhm.
to talk about racism. Uh,
And so my first response, and I love you, Paul, but that means that you're not ready to talk about racism. So I put it right back on the teacher that your kids are ready. Kids as early as age 3 can recognize and articulate difference. They can recognize it, from infancy, but they can talk about it at age 2 and 3. So kids can recognize and talk about difference. And when kids are and they can also recognize and talk about hierarchies. Age 3, Paul, like the kids can recognize and talk about hierarchies. And so like kids, like if you ask, if you ask kids which flavor is better, strawberry or lemon, the kid will tell you, right? And they don't. And what's interesting is kids learn this by watching others around them. I watch how people in my life respond to lemons. I watch how people in my life respond to strawberries. Oh, my mom makes a weird face when she responds to lemons. And so even though I don't have a lot of experience with lemons, I don't like lemons because I watch how my mom responds to lemons. And so kids do the same about people. My mom crosses the street when brown people are coming, so I don't like brown people. Or my mom has no brown friends, and I know that brown people exist, so they must not be good. And so kids make these associations and start like building these inferences. I am lucky enough, again, I do this work and I'm raising young kids. And gosh, my own daughter, this was when she was 3 years old. She was going to a wonderful daycare in Brooklyn, fantastic daycare. With so many caring educators. But at age 3, my daughter came home one day, and again, like there are so many just intense moments that you have when you're parenting children. But she comes home at age 3 and she's like, Dad, I can't be a princess. And I was like, what you mean you can't be a princess? She was like, well, we're choosing costumes for like some costume day they were going to have, and I can't be a princess. And I was like, well, why can't you be a princess? So she was like, well, I looked at all the princess books and none of the princesses are brown. And so she did that deductive reasoning. I looked at all the princess book in my nursery library. None of the princesses are brown in my nursery library. So I deduced that I can't be a princess. My 3-year-old says this to me. And so right away, and I am not a fan of princess books, but right away I went and bought all the brown princess books, a copy for home and a copy for the school. Because that my daughter is making these statements, and it didn't come from her teacher. I talked to the teacher. Her teacher never said those words, but because the library looked like it looked, my daughter drew that inference. And so, and I remember at age 3 talking to her about representation, where I used even that word. I was like, there are certain princesses that are not represented in your classroom. And so your dad's going to go buy all the books so that those princesses are. My daughter at age 3 understood that. Kids understand this. And so I think it's really, really important that we are consistently talking about kids. And the beautiful thing is when kids don't understand, guess what? They ask questions, right? And so kids are living question machines. And so whenever I am in over my head with a kid, I just ask them, are you with me? You're getting what I'm saying? And kids will be like, nah, I'm not. I'm wondering about this thing. And then you like share it. But there are so many books, and one of the things I'll share there are so many books. I'll post a couple of links as we draw to a close, but there's a lot of books that like talk about how to do critical literacies with young people. that kids can do this. And often when we say that it's the kids that are not ready, we're really saying that I, as a teacher, am not ready, or I, as the teacher, am afraid of their parents. That's what we're really saying. And so I'll name for people. So when you say the kids aren't ready, what you're really saying is that you're not ready to do this, or you're not ready for those parent phone calls when they come. So I can get you ready for those parent phone calls. I can get you ready to do this. And I think that that's important. And I hope, folks, that you're using this experience, that Paul has us all together here, and that you all have access to the classroom. I hope that you're getting to know each other and becoming friends on these back channels. One of the things that I think about is almost all of my learning has happened alongside peers and teachers. That everything I know, again, it's because I stay up late and nerd out with teachers like you. So.
I also remember reading a study, this was maybe 10 years ago, that found that by age 2,
Yeah.
Children of color, children of the global majority, were already processing observations of their families experiencing racism.
Yeah.
And so I always thought that this thing like these kids aren't ready, really they're talking about really the desire there is maybe to protect some false innocence of white kids.
Absolutely.
But if kids are old enough to experience and observe racism, then kids are old enough to talk about racism.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm in a mixed race family. My wife is white, and I have white in-laws. And there was a moment where my black biracial daughter, was with her grandparents, my two white in-laws, and they were in Walmart. And my daughter accurately named an instance of racism that her grandparents could not, where where someone had attempted to cut in line in front of a black woman that was one aisle over from them. And my daughter just simply, in her assertive Brooklyn way, at age 8, assertively said to the person, "There's a woman who's been standing here, you can't do that." And she kind of said this to this white man who was attempting to kind of get to the front of the line. And she kind of called it out in Walmart, and her grandparents were like, "She knows how to do that." And we had to help them. They've lived their entire lives as white folks, and so we had to help them understand that she's a brown girl in Brooklyn. We've had to teach her how to be assertive and how to call out behaviors that abridge the rights of others. And so it was really powerful for her grandparents to see this 8-year-old kid kind of moving in this way. And so that was really, really powerful. Yeah.
Lots of other really good questions here. What do you think about, a couple of questions kind of along these lines. What do you think about engaging students in a process of examining racism in their own school and how racism is operating in their own school?
That's the best work. That if you want to change the world, you got to start from your corner. And so whenever I engage kids in activism, we start at our own school. Or we start in our own classroom, and I talk to kids about systems, right? And I don't use that word unless the kids are ready for it, but I talk about that there are rules, right? And there are rules that favor and advantage some kids, and there are rules that disadvantage other kids. And so let's think about the rules that govern our classroom and how we can renegotiate the rules so that all kids are seen as capable through the rules. I did this in 2nd grade recently. And here's what the kids said to me, and kids are brilliant. So I talked to them about rules and how rules disadvantage some kids and advantage other kids. And I talked to them quite openly about race and ability and class and gender. That these are things that I name, because kids come to kindergarten and already start telling you what girls can do and what boys can do. Kids come, that they have these things that they brought in from outside from their parents. And so we were looking at the rules in 2nd grade, and I talked to kids about systems, how systems benefit some kids and disadvantage other kids. And I asked them what rules they wanted to work on. And this is what they told me. This is winter in New York. In winter in New York, everybody wears boots. You have your snow boots because you walk to school. We don't have yellow buses, so everybody walks to school, and kids have to leave their snow boots outside the classroom so that they don't bring water into the classroom from the snow. And so there's this little bin at the front of the classroom when you first enter where all the snow boots go, so that like nothing in the classroom gets dirty. But the rug where all the second graders sit kind of meets that bin at the corner. So there's this one corner of the rug during snowy season that's always soggy. And so when the kids sit at the rug, no one wants to sit on that corner of the rug because it's always soggy and kind of muddy from the snow. And one of the kids said that the rules, like one rule that was unjust in the classroom. And I didn't even introduce, I did talk to them about race, I talked to them about class, I talked to them about gender. But they were like, when you invite people to the rug to sit for the read aloud, if you move slowly, you end up having to sit on the wet corner of the rug. And they were like, Mr. Minor, your rules disadvantage kids who move slowly, and that's a system that we need to redesign because it's not fair. And so like I was guilty, like 100% guilty, that they were like, we have kids that don't move across the room as quickly as other kids. And so the way that the rules go in the classroom, those kids are always disadvantaged and they always have to sit on the corner of the rug that is soggy from the snow. And once the first kid mentioned that, they erupted. They came to life, and they were like, "Oh, and this rule for girls, and this rule for like, for the kids that walk, and this rule for the kids, And so, I think we have to get over our own sensitivity. It would have been really easy in that moment for me to say, "Well, guys, I'm not trying to be unfair. You just got to get to the rug quickly, or to do the student blaming thing. Well, it's your fault for not moving fast enough to the meeting area." But really, I had to take them seriously. And so when kids see an adult taking their concern seriously, that in the grand scheme of oppression in the world, is that the most serious thing? No. But in second grade, is that the most serious thing? Absolutely. And so when kids see adults like taking interest in the small injustices of seventh grade, their agency or their levels of agency rise, and they can tackle the bigger injustices of a larger Brooklyn.
So several people asked for a little bit more clarification around that notion of moral ambiguity.
Oh, absolutely.
And especially, how does moral ambiguity intersect with racism?
Yeah. So one of the things that has been fascinating for me to watch kids, and this is like really, actually, this has been the third graders have really taught me a lot about this, where a third grader told me outright, he's like, "I get it, Mr. Minor, like we act in the interest of others, that I can't be about my own self-interest." They understood that much, right? So I was talking about self-interest and how when you're always acting in your own self-interest, you end up excluding others. And that leads to racism, that leads to sexism, that leads to classism. And so he's like, I understand that part, that I can't always be acting in my own self-interest. But when I act in the interest of others, somehow it feels wrong to me. Like when I share resources with others, when I redistribute resources, when I redistribute time. And in third grade, I was talking about airtime. I was talking to kids about how much boys tend to talk in classrooms and how much girls tend to talk in classroom, and how boys take up a lot of space and how white boys take up the most space. And so I was talking to kids about monitoring their airtime in third grade. And so one way that we can have a just classroom is when you pay attention to your own airtime and you invite others to the conversation before you speak. And so we were practicing that, how to invite others. So if you were a boy, how to check yourself, look around the room, make eye contact with girls who in American classrooms don't speak up as much, and invite one of your girl colleagues to speak up before you contribute. So I was talking to the boys about this. A third grade boy says to me, when I invite girls to the conversation, I understand that that's the right thing to do. I understand that it extends an opportunity to somebody who is not me, but it still feels wrong because I want to talk. And he just said that to me. He's like, I want to talk. I got stuff to say. And so when I invite others, I end up sitting here being really mad. I know it's the right thing to invite them, but I'm really mad that I did it. And so allowing him the space to live in that moral ambiguity is important for his development. That he, that so many times at home, kids never have the chance to sit in that discomfort. And he was feeling really weird about it. He was like, I want to talk. I have something to say first. I had the first idea. I think I have the best voice. Why do I have to invite her? And so what he was struggling with, and he didn't have the words for it, he was struggling with decentering himself and bringing in somebody else. Now, of course, adults have that language, but he didn't have language. But I want kids to practice that, and I can't help you with that. I just got to give you that practice. And so what we practice is, yeah, when you feel in your stomach that you really want to talk and you create an opportunity for somebody else, and now you're mad, it's important to sit there and feel that. And it's important to think about, why you feel that, and think about why you think you might be more entitled to talk than her. And I remember I told him that we were going to get 3 opportunities to practice this, and then we would come back and think about it. So like I said, I want you to count 3 times when you do that. So when you invite another person to the conversation that's not you, we're going to do it 3 times. And then I want you to check in with me about how you feel after you've done it a few times. And after 3 times, he told me, he's like, I'm still mad, but she did have some really important things to say, so I understand why I did that. And so you could see him working through it, that it's not going to happen instantly, right? We all have these dreams where we're going to teach kids to do the right thing, and all of a sudden they're going to do it, and there's going to be unicorns and rainbows. And that's not how it happens. When I'm teaching 3rd grade boys how to decenter themselves in a classroom, it's tricky. And so allowing kids that space to live in that. And he said, like, I feel mad. Like, why do I have to give her my turn to talk? But if we don't do it with the 3rd grade boy, he becomes the 32-year-old man who talks down to women, right? Or he becomes the 32-year-old white man who talks down to Black folks. And so I think that that's really, really important.
So some people also asked about this idea of habits of mind and what are anti-racist habits of mind. And I also, and we just have a few minutes left, unfortunately, but and what are the habits of mind, anti-racist habits of mind that teachers need before they should be, that's kind of what I'm curious about too.
Yeah.
What do I need to understand before I embark on this?
And so it's interesting. The same habits of mind for kids are the same ones for teachers. And so, for example, one habit of mind that I talk to kids about, and this is true of adults too, we have a rule in any classroom that I'm in. So those of you who've been in classrooms with me, you know this, but 3 before me is what I teach kids. That anytime you want to say a thing, you have to think about others and their positionality first. And in your head, like, count 3 people. What would Paul think about this from his perspective? And then you think in your head, what would the person sitting across the table from me who is Asian think about this? What would the person sitting across the aisle from me who is disabled think about this? And so 3 before me. And so I practice with kids, and I'll say something like, I'm going to ask a question and ask you your thoughts on an issue. And I want you to consider the issue from the perspective of 3 other people in this class before you raise your hand to speak. And so practicing with kids, how do I think about other people in the room who are not me before I open my mouth to speak? When we think about how business is done in the United States, if more people did 3 before me, we would have so fewer problems. And so I want kids to be in the habit of thinking about other people's positionality before they give comments, before they speak. And so that's a habit of mine. But then also teachers. So what if our school superintendents did 3 before me? So what if our school superintendents thought about the disability community? What if they thought about, Black communities? Or what if they thought about, poor communities, and actively practice that 3 before me? And so that's been a thing that I've been working on with kids, a habit of mine. And it becomes fast. At first it's long because you can see kids like, okay, Paul, this is what Paul would think. All right, I got it. Okay, Cornelius, this is what he would think. And so at first it's kind of slow, but then after a few days, kids get really fast at it. And then I introduce specific groups that I want them to think about. One of the things that I'll say is that oftentimes when decisions are made, people who don't make as much money as our parents make, or people who are considered poor, who live below poverty, like, their needs don't often get considered. So in your 3 before me, I always want you to think about someone who's really struggling to get food on the table. I always want you to think about someone who might not have books in their home. I always want you to think about someone who might not have a warm coat to wear. And so building those habits of mind where kids begin to do that kind of thinking is really, really important. And you can do that through literacy. You can do that in math. One of my favorite things to do in math and science is to think about scientists who are not white men. And so when we think about theories, we think about, like, well, how did this other scientist see this, who was a woman? How did this scientist see it, it? Who was a person from the Middle East? How did this, and so that we can do this in our subject areas. Another habit of mine that's really important for teachers, and kids can try this too. Who was this made for, and how do I remake it so that it can serve more people? And so anytime there's a policy, anytime there's a lesson, who is this made for, and how can I remake it so that it serves more people? And so when I'm asked to teach a lesson, who is this made for? Was it made for my kids with disabilities? Was it made for my kids with print-based processing issues? Was it made for my Black kids? Was it made for my poor kids? Was it made for my gay kids? So who is this made for? How can I remake this so that it serves all people better? Is another habit of mine. So those are two that I lean into with kids and adults when I'm first starting to work with them. It's three before me. Let me consider the perspectives of others. And then every artifact that moves through my classroom, who is this made for, and how do I remake it? And I always tell people, spoiler alert, more than likely it was made for white kids. And so how do we remake this so that it can serve all people powerfully? So do we need to add text? Do we need to add different perspectives? I did an audit of a science book with a group of children, like I was sharing with you. Cass and I met with some kids last week, and we were looking at a science book, and I did an audit with some kids of the science book that they'll be using in 6th grade, where we looked through the science book together and did an audit. And I asked the kids, where are women in this science book? Where are Africans in the science book? Where are Asians in the science book? And where are Europeans in the science book? And so the kids were all looking for different things. One of the things that we discovered, the first woman didn't show up until chapter 7 in the science book. That is 10 weeks into school. So according to our science book, no woman did anything significant in science for the first 10 weeks of our school year. And the kids were like, we're not okay with that. But they told me that, in our audit. Now, of course, I knew that that's what they would discover, but teaching kids to engage in that kind of critical discourse in 6th grade, well, these are 5th graders who will be 6th graders next week, right? But that they went through their science book and they were like, wow, this science book is full of European men. There's no women here for 10 weeks. And then talking with them about, so what do you think we should do about that? And the first thing they're like, we need more women. We can't do science without women. But the kids said that. I didn't have to say that. I simply asked the questions. And so kids can do this work.
Yeah, I've told this story before. I had my 8th grade language arts teacher, Ms. Cap, on the very first day of school. This is pretty much the only thing I remember from 8th grade. The very first day of school, she hands out the literature books and tells us to turn to the table of contents. And our very first conversation we had is, who is and isn't represented in this table of contents? So then the whole course was built on that. And it's like, and I really believe I would not be doing what I do now if it wasn't for the seed that was planted that day. It's like my critical lens was planted that day just by this one, little activity. We're unfortunately out of time. Actually, we're a little bit old. There's so much more to talk about, and there are a lot more great questions, and I will, I'll look through all these questions and make sure that they get addressed. Luckily, this month there are 5 Tuesdays in September, so we have 5 sessions to try to get to all of this instead of 4. And I just want to mention one last thing that I really take from and I was kind of jotting notes for myself about this. I think one sort of message that you didn't say this explicitly, but I think it's a message that came very clearly, is that I think a big mistake a lot of us educators make teaching anti-racism is we teach the way we always teach, and then we think in October we can just throw in a lesson about anti-racism.
Exactly.
And students are going to be able to talk about it, but we actually have to demystify that and normalize that as part of the conversation and as a lens, not as a separate thing, but just as a lens that we're applying. And so you really had me sort of thinking about that and how to help educators think about that. Do you want to say anything, maybe say something about your book so everyone can, I know a bunch of these folks have already read it, but.
Yeah, I'm working on another one, so that's exciting. But yeah, so I write books. We Got This is out, so you can find it at independent bookstores. You can find it online at Heinemann.com or on Amazon if you want to support the billionaire. But all like I'm really excited about that book. And what it's allowed me to do in the world. So We Got This is an exciting book. You can get it on audio, so that's there too. But really, I just want to remind you that one of the most powerful resources is your colleagues and your community. Listen to kids, listen to kids, listen to kids. The best reading that you can do. Listen to kids outside of your community. Listen to kids who couldn't afford to live in your community. Listen to kids who wish they were, working with you. So like listening to kids is really important. And that when we think about this work, we cannot forget the communities of indigenous people who have been doing this literally since the beginning of that to the United States. And so that I am always thinking about the indigenous educators, the indigenous communities, the indigenous knowledges that make their way into these anti-racist like practices that we are doing. So that is really important. But thank you, thank you, thank you for being here.
All right, thanks, Cornelius. And I recommend to everyone who hasn't read We Got This to read it. It's beautifully written, and it's in both form and substance a truly transformative framework, and so really wonderful. So check that out. Thanks, Cornelius. Good to see you. I feel like we've been seeing a lot of each other, so
Yes.
kind of getting used to this. So
Yeah, this is a really great. And if anybody needs anything, I'm on all social media, so you can find me on Twitter, on Instagram, all that stuff. I do engage with people, so please reach out. This is a delicate time, so if I miss your message right now as we're struggling to get school started, please know that I see you and I'll get back to you. But thank you, thank you, thank you.